The law matters. Of course it does. Welcome once again. I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this long-running program continues to provide legal information, relevant examples, and practical assistance to help you with the law matters. A better understanding of the law puts you in a better position to decide how to protect yourself, your family, and your business. As we present various topics, we do so that you may decide that you can handle some issues yourself. If you do decide to enlist a professional, you'll be better prepared, so will the professional that you select. Our goal, as always, is to help you to save time, money, and to achieve the best possible results. And once again, we want to welcome and thank Attorney David Bizarre from the Bizarre & Associates law firm in East Providence as he continues to weigh in on the various topics that we discuss. So today, the essentials of business and franchises. So starting a business from scratch can be one of life's most exciting adventures and also one of the most challenging and daunting ones. So today we're here to help. We're going to ask and answer some of the questions that you should ask, but perhaps didn't think to ask. First, a few business by the numbers. 32.5 million is the number of U.S. small businesses, and currently 19.9% of those businesses are owned by women. And one other interesting factoid, 37% of Americans have made more of an effort to shop local than ever before. $48 out of every $100 that's spent at a small business stays local. Good to know. So if you're thinking about starting a small business, perhaps going solo proprietorship, one-person operation, you might also be considering a partnership. Maybe you worked in an office with someone pre-COVID. Maybe you both enjoy making widgets together. Maybe you both enjoy just making money together. Maybe you just thought it would be a good idea. That may be fraught too. So what are the pros and cons of the different forms of businesses, of corporations, of maybe even picking a franchise that's already existing, and maybe they make the widgets that you like anyway? So in any scenario, there are liabilities and legal responsibilities. What are they? You should know before you get involved, and what happens to them, how you should handle contracts can be very disconcerting if you don't understand the lay of the land. So today we're here to discuss them, and let's start, David, with those basic forms of business. We know the easiest is just going it alone, but even that too is fraught. So why don't you give us a tutorial on those forms of business, please?
So you started with sole proprietorships, which is I open up my doors, I welcome people in, and I'm running my business. The biggest problem with the sole proprietorship is your liability, because anything you do, you're individually responsible for because you are the business. So we try to tell people that the advantages of a sole proprietorship are not so great that you wouldn't want to create some kind of corporation or LLC to protect yourself from liability. And in that type of situation, probably the best form to use would be an LLC, where we'd check off disregard the entity from the owner, because it's the same taxes as a sole proprietorship. It's passed through to you, but you get the benefit of the protection of the limited liability company.
So when you mentioned sole proprietorship, easiest, you open the door, hang out the shingle, you're in business. If you wanted to grow that business too, though, you might have more trouble getting money. People don't know who you are. It's not quite the entity that something like an LLC is. Also less paperwork. Every time you go beyond that sole proprietorship, certainly there's not...
Some paperwork.
Yes.
There's some paperwork, but the amount of paperwork that's required to open and then maintain an LLC is so insignificant compared to the benefits that you would get. So the ease of opening a sole proprietorship, as I said, is far outweighed by the protection of the LLC. And to open an LLC, you file with the Secretary of State or Commonwealth the Articles of Organization. That's the creation of the LLC. You explain to the state in your paperwork what the purpose of it is, who the manager is, if it's managed by a manager, or if it's member, you don't even really have to even list the members, and you pay the fee. So there's a little bit of a fee, and there's a little bit of paperwork, but there's a lot more protection.
And then other forms of business, I mentioned at the beginning, so you have a friend, you thought you wanted to start a business. It's a partnership, can be fraught, can be controlled. How does that work, David?
So you can form a partnership. Now, the problem with a partnership, very much like the problem of a sole proprietor, actually expanded by the number of partners, is you're liable, again, for any action or malfeasance even by your partner or yourself. So the advantage of a partnership is you can divide up the taxes, and the income as it comes in can be taxed to the partners in a different way, however you set it up. The expenses can be shared by a partner, however you set it up. But you can get that same advantage by creating an LLC and then checking off partnership instead of disregard the entity. So now that LLC will give you the protection from liability of the limited liability company, but you don't have the, and you still have the advantage of the pass-through taxes as you would in a partnership.
And even if you're partners and you like each other, there are still so many other things that need to be spelled out. What happens if one wants out? What happens if one passes? What happens if someone else wants to buy in? What happens if one doesn't do what he or she is supposed to do? How do you do the division of labor? Are all of those things in part of what the partnership agreement or an LLC is? What's the difference in that, David?
So when you have more than one person who owns the company, you do want to have an agreement. Whether it's a partnership agreement, which will spell out all of those things you talked about, which include, while we're running it, who has what responsibilities, how we're dividing up the income, how we're dividing up the liability or expenses, what happens if one of us dies, how do we sell our share out if we don't die and we just want to get out. All of those rules can be laid out in a partnership agreement. You can also do that in an LLC operating agreement. So whether it's being taxed as a partnership or taxed as a S corporation or a C corporation or whatever type of tax setup you use, you would still want to have articles of organization to lay out all of those other issues, such as one of us dies, can we leave our share to whomever we want, or does it get bought out? What happens if one of us just wants to leave or be bought out? All of those things can be spelled out in an operating agreement.
What's the difference between an LLC and an LLP, limited liability partnership? What are the differences?
So a limited liability company is governed under the articles or the statutes that give you what your rights and rules and regulations are. From a practical standpoint, the LLC has an operating agreement generally and limited liability for the owners because the company is a company, and it's flexible. An LLP has limited liability for some of the partners. There's usually a general partner, but also limited partners. And the partners who are the limited partners have limited liability, but generally it can be liability up to the amount of their capitalization or what they put into the company.
Good to know. And then if it's not a sole proprietorship, LLC, LLP, full boat corporation, what's the difference between the C and the S?
So the difference between the C corporation and the S corporation is the taxation. An S corporation is a pass-through, so each of the owners are given at the end of the year, I think it's a K1, which is, this is your share of the income or net profit, and or your share of the loss, and you report that directly on your own tax return, and therefore the taxes are spread out to the owners as opposed to being taxed at the corporate level, a C corporation, and then if you wanted to distribute from the corporation any profits, it's in the form of a dividend where you would pay tax again. So some people call that double taxation.
And what about the amount of general paperwork that goes on between LLCs and LLPs and corporations? More or less, more costly to operate? What are the pros and cons, David?
Well, corporations and LLCs require annual reporting to the Secretary of State's office. So there is, and it's actually been in Rhode Island moved both LLCs and corporations between January and March. They used to be spread out a little bit. So we're doing those all now. And it's an annual report just to give the state two things: a report on who's operating the company, if it's a manager, and that the company is still in existence, and give them the opportunity to collect their $50 filing fee in Rhode Island, more in Massachusetts.
Good to know. So much of this information is certainly available online. I know I've taught classes for the small business development centers. They're throughout the country. There are resources about these things online, and there are check boxes that say, if this, then that, if this, then you should suggest that. So while someone could go through this, if someone were to say to you, gee, David, counselor, I'm thinking about starting a business, what would a lawyer do to help someone go through the paces, even though they might perhaps walk in and say, David, small biz, I only need a sole proprietorship. What would you do to put them through the paces to help them to discern where they should be filing and how they should be setting up their form of business structure?
So the first thing we would do is sit down to determine what the company or business that they want to enter into is. What are their long-term plans? What are their short-term plans? How many people are going to be involved? And after we start discussing those things, then what they should do will come more into focus. For example, if someone comes in and says, I want to open up any sole proprietor type of business, let's say I want to cut hair. Okay, so it's just them, and they don't need any investors long-term, and they probably aren't taking on any partners long-term or short-term. So I would probably tell that person, good idea, let's do it in the form of an LLC, disregard the entity from the owner, so the taxes are passed through to you. We'll do the paperwork, make sure it's done right, but you can certainly do that yourself if you're comfortable and capable of doing that, because as you said, it's just forms where you're basically checking this and doing that, and for the most part, that's pretty straightforward. If someone came in and said, well, my friend and I and two other friends want to open up a business, and it's just going to be us, but we want to do this long-term, then I would say, well, then we're going to do either an S corporation or an LLC, but probably an LLC. And it could either be a partnership or an S corporation tax basis that I would leave to an accountant to decide. But I would tell them, now you need me, because not only do you need to form the corporation through the Articles of Organization or the LLC, but you need an operating agreement to put in place all of the things we talked about earlier, so that there's no issues down the road as who's responsible for what, who's going to put what money into it, how are we sharing the income, how are we sharing the expenses, what happens if I want to leave, how do I get my share out? So I would at that point say you want an attorney to do those documents. Someone could come in and say, I have this idea, I'm going to eventually go out for maybe venture capital, or I'm going to want a lot of investors down the road. That one we probably would want to do in the form of a corporation, because then you can sell stock. We authorize 100,000 shares, or how many shares we need to make sure there's enough shares in the treasury of the corporation to sell to investors down the road. And we create a corporate book, corporate minutes, articles of the company, the corporate articles, and we do all of that with a seal, and you want an attorney for that.
Sounds right. So we say we're going to go over these things so that we can avoid some troubles. Suppose they didn't go this route. They did start a business, two people. It falls apart for whatever reason. The business does, someone passes, someone just decides they want out. What happens to that entity now? Is it just that it can simply be dissolved? As we've talked about the dissolution of businesses in prior segments, that's not as easily done as one could have imagined. And does the state end up deciding who gets what?
The parties can do it themselves if they're able to do it themselves. So if you're talking about a corporation or a business or an LLC or some entity where the two people have been working together and have maybe gathered some assets, some inventory, some equipment, whatever, accounts receivable. That type of company that you're going to close down, you'd probably want to go through more of a formal process to do that, so that you can agree between the two partners how you're going to do a dissolution, so to speak, what is going to get sold off, if you can sell it off, what are you going to do, pay off all your bills. Once your bills are all paid off, how are you going to divide up the assets that are left, hopefully that have been put into cash, and then do a dissolution with the Secretary of State's office so the corporation or LLC is closed.
Sounds good. And apart from or beyond the articles of incorporation or whatever business structure that needs to be filed and taken care of, there are often other things that people need to be aware of when they're getting involved in business. Other licenses, yes, if you're a hairdresser or you're going to be opening a bar, there are those kinds. What are the kinds of licenses need to happen, and do you think that that's something that someone easily could check out online and take care of themselves, or not?
Depending on the type of business, yes, a lot of people could be able to do that. There are state licenses for if you're going to make retail sales, a permit to make sales at retail. If you're going to have a business where you're selling food or liquor, you need a liquor license or a victualer's license. There's local permits and licensing that you may need to get at the town or city hall, wherever you're opening up. So there are a number of things you have to check off, but if you've been in that type of business before and now you're starting your own, many times people will know exactly what they need, but an attorney can help with those types of things too.
And zoning, someone typically could find that out themselves, but they may not necessarily know. Even if they were making candles in another plant, they might not know that your city or town, they don't want you to be cooking up whatever you're cooking up, or bathtub gin in the backyard or whatever. So those kinds of things need to be checked out, but certainly something most people can check out themselves.
Yes, you can probably do that, but here's my bigger concern is, you need to know that for where you're operating your business, whether it's by a lease or a home office or whatever you're doing. So you would need to know, if you're doing a home office, what are the rules in your city or town for an office or home office in your town where you live. And a lot of towns will allow a home office, people to work out of their homes. But what is your business? If you're selling things and there are trucks coming in and out and you're storing like a warehouse of items there, that may or may not be allowed where you live as a home office. So you need to check that out and know that before you get into it. If you're in a landscaping business, are you allowed to store your landscaping tractors and trailers and trucks and all of that in your home, or do you have to have a place to store that? That's kind of ordinance or zoning information that you would need to know. What was making me hesitate is, more importantly, is if you enter into a lease with somebody, before you sign the lease, you want to make sure that whatever you're going to operate at that location is allowed by the zoning laws.
Is that something that should be reviewed by a lawyer?
Not only for the zoning aspect of it, but more importantly for the legal aspect of it. Who's responsible for the snow and ice removal? We can talk about that at this time of year. Mm-hmm. Who's responsible for the trash removal? Are you allowed to put up signs? Are you allowed to sublease the property to anybody else if you don't need all of it? Can you assign the lease to another organization? What if you're just changing your organization? Can you easily assign it to the new entity? Those are all kinds of things that can be covered in a lease that you'd want to know before you sign it.
And if you are working with someone who's trying to decide about the form of business and getting them started in business, would you also be the one who would actually review or refer out things such as whatever employer registrations they have to take care of, insurance things, matters that they need to take care of? Perhaps they're registering a trade name, or they would like to register or have a patent on something. Do you review those things? Do you have to refer them to specialists? How does that work,
I
David?
think you name things for like at least 3 different specialists.
Yes, exactly.
So patent and trademark attorneys have a specialty in that area, so you would want to speak to an attorney who does that type of work if there's an issue with that. I think you also talked about something.
Employers?
Yes, but it sounded more like a payroll kind of situation.
Payroll could be. Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to have employees, personally, I would find and get a very good and reputable payroll company that can take care of those issues for you. Can you do them yourself? Yep. Is it QuickBooks? Is that what they call it?
That's one of them.
That might be helpful, or one of those kind of programs if you wanted to try to do some of that. Human resources, HR issues. There are companies that will do that for small and middle-sized companies if it's something that you don't want to hire someone to do or try to take on yourself.
Sounds like these things that people need to know about.
Yep.
And when I started talking to you about this, of course, we didn't get a chance to really review all of the other kinds of contract issues there are, but there are a lot of contract issues that could cause more trouble than even starting up a business and dealing with the form of a business. So as we read, there's always an issue about what a breach of contract is. What does that actually mean, and where would a small business likely get into trouble that way?
So there's a lot of different contracts that can be an issue for a business. Mm-hmm. Are you signing a contract for computer or technology assistance? Yes, probably. And what are the terms of that contract? And if you don't understand the terms and you want to end it sooner rather than later, what are the terms for ending it? So yeah, I would have an attorney review that if you didn't see in black and white exactly what you expected to see. I see a lot of smaller businesses or even mid-sized businesses that have credit card services where they sign agreements for credit card companies that they don't understand the cost of it and getting out of it, and getting out of it to go to another company creates all sorts of breach of contract issues. You better be careful before you sign an agreement on that and make sure you understand fully what your responsibilities are, what the length of the term of the agreement is, and what you have to do to get out of those kind of agreements.
So obviously we can't go through all of those things right here and right now, but you started to mention a couple of specific things. In general, when someone starts to look at a contract, quickly they could say, I don't want to cover this, let's let the lawyer deal it. Do you worry, are you more concerned about things that are too broad or too narrow, or is it both?
Both, and it depends on the circumstances and the situation. But generally speaking, the client's going to understand what their deal is with each of the groups that they're signing. It's the smaller things that they might not think about, which is how long a term is this for? What are the costs of getting out of it? Is there an early termination fee? Those kinds of things.
Is it worth it to handle it first before it becomes a problem rather than enlist your services later to negotiate it out and deal with it afterwards?
Absolutely. You don't want to have to come to a lawyer and say, I'm getting sued for tens of thousands of dollars because I terminated this agreement and moved on to another one. Well, if you had gone to the lawyer first before you terminated it, you would have been able to know what your rights are and either how you get out of it correctly or what you should have had in there before you signed the agreement, which is the best time to see the lawyer.
So speaking of contracts, this is a good time to use this as a springboard to, okay, so you know you like making widgets, you might be considering that you'll be avoiding so many of these problems if you just and only buy a franchise, which is already an existing business with existing contracts, with existing, some of them have leases already in place or are likely to negotiate it out for you. How is that likely to be fraught? What should someone watch out for, be careful of, and do they need a lawyer to review all facets of that franchise agreement and contract?
Absolutely. So the franchise agreement has a lot of different issues to it that you need to know about, and of course there are expenses that are involved. And so the question sometimes is the value that I'm getting from that franchise worth the expense? And for many of them, it absolutely is, because as you said, there's a systemized way of buying things, a systemized way of dealing with the public, because what the franchisor wants is to make sure that everybody who buys their franchise is doing the job in exactly the same way as all the others, because that's what they're selling, that consistency. So if you went to a McDonald's in Illinois, I think that's where it started, maybe, or McDonald's was in California, but Ray Kroc was in Illinois. The McDonald's in Illinois is the same as the one in East Providence.
Yes.
So they want that same consistency, and it's the same thing with any other franchise. They want you to do business the way that the franchise sets it up, and they'll grade you on that and make sure you follow those things. But you need to know, what is it if I want to do something differently. Am I allowed to? Can I get my ketchup from a different supplier? Probably not. But there's a whole lot of things that go into the franchise agreement that you need to know about, including what if you want to sell the franchise? Does the length of the franchise and the renewal fee match up to the lease where you're building your building? What are the costs of your build out to build the franchise to conform to their requirements? So every franchisor has a different method of doing things, so you should contact an attorney and say, here's the offering, because they have to give you an offering first, and here's what the franchise agreement will look like, and what are my rights, and what do I need to know about.
So when we started to talk about the various contracts that might be a problem, you might need to have them reviewed, the franchisor has to have that as part of his franchise documentation. So the franchisee, potential franchisee, might not need to go through each and every one and go through this, but someone is, and namely, that's likely to be a lawyer who's going to mince and parse every single word to make sure that there isn't a clause in there that, such as you suggested. In fact, one came up where someone was making donuts, and the franchisee had been approached to include gluten-free donuts, except it wasn't as part of the agreement, the franchise agreement. Now what? So to your point, what kind of options can you construct, build in, or do you have no leverage or control whatsoever? So those are important things to
They are, and it
discuss.
depends on who the franchisor is. If it's a multinational franchise, their agreements are probably very difficult to negotiate any of the terms to. If it's a smaller, 5, 10, 15 chain group, they might be more open to allowing you to make some changes to their franchise agreement. There are some rules that they have to follow because you can't do things differently with different franchisees, but there might be some terms that they would be able to put into their agreement that would work for you if there are slight changes you needed. But for the most part, those things aren't that negotiable. It's not as much of an arm's length transaction as you would like it to be. So the important part of the attorney is to let you know exactly what it is you're signing, and where there is room, depending on who the franchisor is, to negotiate, you want to have those items that you can negotiate negotiated.
And so as you point out, just as you would have to do your homework even before bringing your prospective business to a lawyer, you have to do some on your own if you're thinking about buying a franchise, whether it's the business itself and all the variables before they say, I think this is exactly the kind of business I want to do. And hopefully you can help people vet that as well, because it certainly can be a long time commitment as opposed to just opening a door and hanging out a shingle as a sole proprietor.
And it's expensive.
And it's expensive. We hope that this has been helpful to you in considering your options as a potential entrepreneur going forward, and we hope that you continue to stay tuned to the Law Matters. As we say, it matters to you. Thank you for tuning in.